All right, good afternoon, GPAR. How's it going on this cloudy, what day is it? It's Thursday. Hope you're all doing well this afternoon. So glad to have so many of you in here today. Before we get into our workshop with Janice, a couple of different things I'd like to remind you of. One, we're going to be having a fair housing workshop on the 29th of this month. We're going to have some messaging going out to everybody, so just keep your eye on your inbox for that. We'd love to see a jam-packed room. We're going to have a great speaker with us, Nate Johnson. He is nationally respected for speaking on the subject of fair housing. So he's a rock star in that space, and we're so glad to have him. So we would be even more glad and happy to have you there with us as well. So keep an eye on your inbox for that information. And then also too, we've been reaching out to all of you about what's been going on in City Council as it relates to property assessments. We had launched a call to action, and very glad to report many of you responded to that and sent lots of emails to City Council. Well, the job isn't done yet. The legislative process is still working its way, and it will come to a final resting stop next Thursday, a week from today. So we're going to be pulling out more stops to let council know where our position is. So keep an eye on your inbox. When we're reaching out to you, please, when we put out that next call for action, we need you to go ahead and fire it up one more time. Let the realtor voice be heard for property owners all across the city, specifically as it relates to things like homestead exemption, the long-term owner occupancy program. There are lots of things out there that can give some relief to our property owners as it relates to their property taxes. So the best way to let council know is to send them some emails. So keep an eye on your inbox on that. All right, enough about all that housekeeping. Let's get to the presenter, the task at hand, and that is we're talking listing contracts. We have Janis Benstock, awesome contributor to our GPAR family. She has served on the board of directors. She is a PAR director here this year with us. She has done multiple presentations before, and she owns the title of the most watched YouTube video in GPAR history.
Holla. I'm so proud that I won a trophy. And do me all a favor, maybe we'll drop the link in there. You guys could all watch it. YouTube only, you need 30 seconds, and then we'll add more views, and that way I'll pad my pad my spread so that nobody catches up to me. Fair enough. Okay. We ready? Did I stole the show? Is it my turn? Here we go. Okay, so first of all, hello everybody. I'm super excited to be here. And I am really glad that you guys took the time to do this because it's super important for your business. And okay, freeze. Okay, super important for your business. And not only is it something that's going to protect you and your broker legally and also protect your client, but one of the main benefits of the listing contract is that it's going to protect your commission. And so the actual reason why this came up, and I don't know if he's here, but this is what happened. I called an agent. I went to go show a property that my clients had told me they were interested in. And when I looked it up on MLS, it said that it had been canceled. So I called the listing agent just to find out what was going on. Is he going to be putting it back? And we got in a conversation, and here's what he told me. The seller got multiple offers and realized how valuable the property was and decided not to sell it. And I said, okay, that makes perfect sense. I can respect that. And I said, just out of curiosity, are you going after him for your commission? He was shocked and had no idea that he could do that. And I gladly helped out. And this is another bigger lesson, is that we are all cooperating. We are not competing. So each and every one of us in this Zoom and in this industry, even though we sometimes are told that we're competing against each other, the reality is we are cooperating, and your reputation with agents in this town, in this industry, is more valuable than your reputation with clients, because we work together all the time and we make deals happen. We move the entire real estate industry. And so I was glad, and I did not say it at all in a pushy or condescending way. I was just literally trying to help him. And I know that we're all busy. I know that there's so many things to know in real estate that it's hard to keep up with everything. And I teach, so I read the book and the contracts like 5 or 6 or 7 times a year, and I'm a broker, so I'm reviewing them all the time. So I know them a little bit better than most agents, only because I read them all the time and I teach them. It doesn't make me any better. So I pointed out to him, he said, where does it say that? So I pointed out to him in the listing contract where it said that. And he was so grateful because he learned something. And that's when I realized maybe members could benefit from doing a little walkthrough of the listing contract. So my plan for today is I'm going to pull it up right in Zip Forms through a screen share. We're just going to pretty much go through it line by line. I'm really informal in case you haven't figured that out yet. We have, I don't know, 30 people in the room, so it's a little too big for everybody to leave their microphones on, but we're not formal. So if you have a question or a comment at any time, just go down to the bottom and throw up your Zoom hand, because if you throw up your Zoom hand, then Zoom is going to move your picture to the front of my screen and I'm going to see you, and then I'll just call on you. As soon as I do, just unmute yourself and ask your question. Totally informal. Look, we have a question already. Go ahead, Shazad. Is that how you say your name?
Shazad, yeah. Thank you so much.
Said it right. Wait, high five for me. Okay. Go ahead. What's your question?
Yeah, I have a question that is there any recording for this Zoom meeting afterward if we need? Because
it's recorded. Yep, and it's going to be on YouTube. So maybe it'll be the second watched YouTube video, second most watched YouTube video on the GPAR channel.
What should I type in for this video?
So you should all subscribe to GPAR's YouTube channel, and that way you'll get notified every single time there's a new video. So if you just literally go onto YouTube, and maybe is somebody else who's not, can throw in the link to GPAR's YouTube channel, and just, yeah, make Donna or Matt or somebody, I don't know who's in there, can do it. I could do it later, but I want to get through this. So if we can put that in the chat, then you can just click on YouTube, click the subscribe button, and then every time GPAR puts up a video on YouTube, you're going to get notified, and then you can watch all the videos.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. All right, then when you're done, put your hand down so I don't get confused. All right, anybody else have any questions? If not, we are just going to get started. And my plan today is to just cover the listing contract, because I could talk all day. But if you have questions about any other disclosures or contracts, feel free to ask. So we're going to go right into Zip Forms, and I have like a sample transaction that I use for when I teach. So that's the one we're going to use now. And I put the office address, my office address, in here. So I'm not really selling this building, but I'm going to put this in here. And this is not really a tutorial on how to use Zip Forms. But if you have any like specific questions about how to play around in Zip Forms, feel free to jump in and ask, and I'll be happy to tell you. Okay, here we go. So the first thing is, and you may or may not remember this from real estate school, depending on how long ago it was, but this is an exclusive right to sell listing contract. And in class, you may have remembered that we learned there's an exclusive right to sell and an exclusive agency. And an exclusive right to sell listing contract is really the gold standard. It's the one that most of us use, especially because it gives the broker the most protection for our commission, and it's the standard form that we have. So it makes sense that this is the one we're going to use. And if you remember from class, the exclusive right to sell contract is the one that says, I'm listing your property for a specific length of time. And during that time, no matter who finds the buyer, I'm getting the commission. You're paying me. I have the exclusive right to sell. And I'm going to show you in this contract where the language is that supports that feeling, that supports that idea. The other kind of contract is called an exclusive agency contract. And that contract says, basically, I'm the only broker that you can pay, but if you sell it yourself, you don't have to pay me. I'm going to show you which language, if you strike that, it turns it into an exclusive agency. However, full disclaimer, I am not an attorney, so I'm not telling you that you can make it into an exclusive agency contract. Your broker or attorney has to tell you that. I'm just showing you to understand where the language is that would make the difference in changing it. So we are going to start with the exclusive listing contract, exclusive right to sell contract. And this is the contract that's in Zip Forms, and we are going to start from there. So you're obviously going to enter your broker's name. Wait, before we go back, two things. One, in zip forms, each one of our forms has a 3 or sometimes 4-letter little acronym. This is only for reference. This is given by PAR, Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. They're the ones that write up these contracts for us. The attorneys write them up. So if you start to remember these from use, you can just plug that into the form search and it will pull it up, but it doesn't mean anything legally. It's just for reference. So XLS is this contract exclusive right to sell. And if you know this, see this on our forms, it's on every form. This form is recommended and approved for, but not restricted to use by members of PAR. And you are a member of PAR, so you get access to this form as part of your dues. So you're going to go in here and you're going to enter all of your information for your broker as well as for yourself. One thing you can do is you can create templates in zip forms that will auto-populate that information in every time you open up any contracts. You don't have to keep typing it over and over again. I didn't enter that in here for this purposes, but you would enter your information in there. And just so you notice, this does not have a place for your license number, but other documents do. My guess, and I should bring it up the next time I'm there, is at some point they're all going to require a license number, and we're starting to use our license number more and more, but it's not required in here. So now you're going to put the seller, their name and their mailing address. Super important about putting the seller's name. We look it up in public record, but we also have to make sure that the person that's signing this contract matches what's in public record. And there are plenty of instances where that might not be the case. And a couple of the simple ones are in the case of an estate sale. So in public record, it says Bob Jones, but in front of you is Sally Marshall. Sally Marshall is Bob Jones's daughter, and she says that she has the right to sell the property because her father died. So in that case, you're going to need some documentation to satisfy you that she in fact has the right to sign this listing contract. Now, obviously, when it gets to title, when we sell the property and then the title insurance company does a search, they're going to verify all these documents. But for you to make sure that you're in compliance, you need to at least do your due diligence, which is say to Sally, well, I see it's in Bob Jones's name. Who is that? It's your dad. He died. I'm so sorry for your loss, right? We treat people like humans. And then she's going to need to provide some documentation to you, which would most likely be the will and maybe the letters of testamentary or something from the probate, from the orphans court. And what I do when I'm not sure, and I am the broker, you can ask your broker, but sometimes the broker doesn't know. I send them to my title company and I say, is this enough? And they'll tell me yes or no, because they're more of an expert in that than I am. So I always want to make sure. Another instance might be, and this happened to me recently in the case of a divorce. They were husband and wife on title, and the wife said to me, we're getting a divorce, and he signed the condo over to me. So I looked it up in public record and it was still in his name. So I reached out and I told her, and she called her attorney, and it turns out the husband signed the deed over to her, but the attorney never recorded it. So she had to go back and make sure that the attorney recorded it. And the problem is, if I signed a listing contract with her and his name wasn't on it and the deed was never recorded, it could have been a problem later. So make sure the seller matches who the seller is and put as much of their information in there as possible. The next thing is that we need to explain to the seller that this is an exclusive right to sell, and we need to make sure that they don't have a listing contract with anyone else. So this answer should almost exclusively always be no. However, there may be a time when a seller is under contract with someone else and that contract is expiring imminently in a week, in 10 days. And the seller knows that if it doesn't sell during that time, they are not renewing with that other listing agent. So in that case, they might say yes, but then they say in the explanation, my contract with ABC is expiring on June 30th, which means this contract can't start until July 1st. So my advice to you is, if you ever have a yes situation, check with your broker and make sure it's okay. But that's just one example of a possible acceptable yes situation. Now, this is really weird, but I see listing contracts often where people forget to put the price in, and I think because it's set off to the right. And I also think because sometimes you start filling out the paperwork before you do the CMA, before you figure out what the listing price is going to be, make sure you go back and fill in the listing price. And we're going to put our listing price, it's 444 North 4th Street, so it's going to be a lot of fours. We're going to put that in there just for fun. Oh, 4 million, why not? Let's say $444,000, $444. So you're going to put the address and the zip code. Make sure that you fill this out. So the city, the county, and the school district. And in my templates, everything I do is Philadelphia. So I fill out Philadelphia, Philadelphia. Now the zoning is important, and you can literally go on public records through MLS, and you can just copy and paste what the zoning is and put that in here. And you're also going to put the present use, vacant, single family, daycare, barbershop, whatever it is. This is mostly residential, but so you're not going to do that, but single family, duplex, vacant land, whatever it is. Now, let's step back for a second and remember the overall purpose of this listing contract. It is an employment contract. The seller is hiring us to do something, but it's a bilateral contract, meaning two promises. We're promising to market and sell the property, and they're promising to pay us a commission. Therefore, we need to define in this contract what it is that we're offering for sale. And if we offer something different from what's in the contract, we might have a problem. And here's what I mean. If in the present use, we put in that it is a duplex, but then when we go to sell it later and we put in that the zoning is a duplex and the seller signs it, basically the seller is agreeing, yes, it's zoned as a duplex, yes, the use is a duplex. And then we go under contract and then we go due diligence and we realize it's not really zoned as a duplex. Guess what we can do now? We can go back to the seller and say, hey, Mr. Seller, you signed a contract with me that I was listing for sale a duplex that's zoned as a duplex. And guess what I did? I found a ready, willing, and able buyer to buy a duplex. And then you can't deliver what you promised me that you were going to deliver. So guess what? You owe me a commission. So there are going to be lots of places in this listing contract where it's super important to be accurate and thorough about defining what you're selling, because remember, that's a way to protect your commission. So we do the identification number. We pull in Philadelphia, we just put the OPA, which stands for Office of Property Assessment. We just pull that tax ID number, and that's enough to identify. A property address is not enough to identify. We need the ID number. If you work in the counties, you might use a lot and block number or something. Check with your broker. I don't really work in the counties. I do everything in Philly. Okay, now we're going to do starting and ending dates of the listing contract called the term. First of all, there's a disclaimer that's in every single one of our contracts that no association of realtors has set or recommended the term of this contract. Broker or licensee and seller have discussed and agreed upon the terms of this contract. That's there everywhere, and that's our antitrust, showing that we're in compliance and we're not violating antitrust. There's no price fixing. Everything is by negotiation. And then we're going to do the starting date. The contract starts when signed by broker and seller, unless otherwise stated here. So when would we put this? We would put this in the case where somebody has a listing contract that's still in effect with ABC Real Estate that ends June 30th, but we're signing this today. So instead of saying it starts June 30th, we're going to say it starts July 1st. Because that's when it started. We're signing it today. It's going to take effect July 1st. The ending date of the contract. The law says that we cannot take listing contracts longer than 1 year. So what I always do, because leap years confuse me, is I will make it like 1 day shy of a year. If I do a year, sometimes I do less than a year, and that's going to be your office policy. So I would do, just to err on the side of caution, or that should be June. I would do like June 29th. That way I know it's not 365 days. If you're smarter than I am, you can actually count 365 days and make it a full year. I like to err on the side of caution. One thing I want to do and go back, and then I'll see if there are any questions, is I want to just remind you guys of this, is that this contract and every contract you sign as a licensee is not really your contract. It is between the broker and the client. You are an agent for the broker. So remember that when you're signing this and you're putting broker, that this contract, and that's why down here it says between the broker / licensee, right here, broker / licensee, you're the representative. You're the one that the seller knows. It's really your client. It's your relationship. But this contract is not between you and the seller. It's between the broker and the seller. And that's something to think about for a lot of reasons. But also the reason is if you decide to leave the company, this contract stays with the broker. The broker can choose to release it and let it go with you, but always remember that these stay with the broker. So when you're switching companies, and that's a whole different strategy, there's that whole thing of like, should I take this listing now? I'm planning to leave in a month. So these are things to consider. And remember, you do not own this contract. You are a representative, an agent for the broker, and it's in their name. Any questions so far? Okay. The next thing is dual agency. So we have to disclose that there's the potential for dual agency. And remember, dual agency means I'm representing the buyer and the seller. So if I'm signing a listing contract, I have no idea who's bringing the buyer. But to keep the door open, to allow myself to be a dual agent, we have to have this disclosure in here. Seller agrees that broker and their licensees may also represent a buyer. A broker is a dual agent when the broker represents the buyer and seller in the same transaction. So if you're ABC Real Estate and you're listing this property and another agent in your office finds a buyer, it is dual agency, because remember, the listing contract is in the name of ABC and the buyer agency contract will be in the name of ABC. So even if you don't personally find that buyer, it's still dual agency. A licensee, that's you, is a dual agent when, unless there are any brokers in here. I don't know if there are any brokers in here. And if you're not a broker, then you're a licensee. So a licensee is a dual agent when a licensee represents a buyer and seller in the same transaction. All of brokers' licensees are also dual agents unless there are separate designated agents for a buyer and a seller. So that could happen in two ways. I'm going to show you one way in paragraph 4. The other way is, let's say you list this property, you do an open house, a buyer that's unrepresented walks in, you guys fall in real estate love and they want to work with you and they want to put in an offer. Now you are representing buyer and seller. You are the dual agent. But if your broker says, wait a minute, that's a conflict of interest, I am taking that buyer away from you and I'm going to give it to Sally because I want that buyer to have separate representation. That means that your broker designated Sally as the buyer's agent. And no, you don't get the commission, and no, you don't get a referral fee, because that's a conflict of interest. If your broker, that's their policy, you might not like it, but there's penny wise, pound foolish. Right? We don't want to be penny wise, pound foolish and go after this commission now. It can end up in litigation and problems later on. So if your broker says, I'm splitting it up, you got to trust your broker that it's for a good reason. And your broker has the ultimate say because they're the ones that are legally responsible. So the next thing is designated agency. And this can sometimes be a little confusing. So when you're signing this listing contract, if you recall from the top, I said all of these contracts are in the name of the broker. That means by default that if you have 100 agents in your office and you sign this contract as agent for the broker, every single one of the agents in your office technically represents that seller, because it's the broker's contract and the broker has 100 agents. All of them represent the seller. That's the default position of agency law. But that's really weird, isn't it? Because there are 99 people in your office that never met the seller, don't even show up, don't even know anything, and they're representing the seller, that's BS. So what are we gonna do? We're gonna say, no, 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 no. Our contract says, we know that's the law, but that's silly. Most of us are gonna want just the licensee to be the designated agent. We're gonna say just the person who's signing this contract is the designated agent. But we have to put a little box in there that says, if you don't agree with us and you want to go back to the law and you want everybody in the office to represent, then our little clause in here about designated agency does not apply. Make sense? In my world, we always leave that unchecked, because in my world, I don't want one agent. I don't want every agent in my office representing the seller. I just want the one who knows the seller, the one who knows the house representing. So we leave that unchecked. That's going to be up to your broker, but I want you to understand what that stands for. No questions? Okay. So broker's fee. This is where it gets really interesting. No association of realtors has set or recommended, again, that disclaimer that there's no price fixing. It's up for negotiation. The next thing is broker's fee is blank. You can put in whatever you want, whatever your broker says you're allowed to do. Your broker is allowed to set what the policy is for the company, but what you're not allowed to ever do is say to the client, oh no, everybody charges 6%. The going rate is 7%. That's what it is. No, I'm not, that's too little. That's not what people charge. We can't ever consciously or subconsciously or inadvertently or blatantly imply or express that there is a going rate, that there is a standard. That is a giant violation of the antitrust laws, and the penalties are severe. So you have to make sure that you remind them it's by negotiation. Now, if I sit down to list your property and you say, how much is it? I say, I charge 7%. And if you say, no, that's too much, I don't want to pay 7%, you can negotiate with me and I can stand firm and say, nope, that's what my company charges. That's what we charge. That's what I charge. And I can say that all day, and I can choose to take or not take the listing. But what I cannot say is, oh no, that's the going rate. That's what people charge. So let's just for fun say I'm charging 7%. So my fee is 7% of the sales price, or $20,000, whichever is higher. Well, I can say whatever I want to say, so long as the seller agrees with it. Whichever is greater. So we could do the math and see what a property has to sell for me to get $20,000 and figure out which would be greater and which would be lower. Whichever is greater and blank. We can also charge another fee. It could be for anything. It could be for marketing. It could be for drone photography. It could be for conveyancing. It could be a technology fee. Whatever we want to charge, we could charge that fee, so long as the seller agrees to it. So this is what we're charging on line 44, if and when we procure a ready, willing, and able buyer. However, this is a really great line that most people are not using, and you should really consider using it. Blank of broker's fee is earned and due, non-refundable at the signing of this listing contract payable to broker. So here's what I can do. I can take this $444, because maybe this is an extra fee because they want me to do some fancy flyers, or they want me to get a drone photography or a clown and mimosas at the first open house. And I can say, fine, I'll do that, but I'm charging you $444 and you have to pay me now, because I'm getting paid that whether this deal closes or not, whether I procure what ready, willing, and able buyer or not. So you can do it that way. The other thing you could do is you could say, maybe there's no extra fee, but I'm going to take $1,000 now. And then when the time comes and we go to closing, instead of 7% or 20,000, it's going to subtract the $1,000 that I already got up front. Has anyone ever had a situation where now that they know this, they wish they would have done it, or that they've done it? Anyone? Because I can think of plenty. I had an agent once who listed like a $1.25 million house in the suburbs, and in Bucks County and maybe Montgomery County, whatever. And the sellers wanted her to drive to New York or take the train, they didn't care, and hand out flyers face to face to brokers, thinking that she was going to get a commuter, you know, like a New York money commuter people in there buying the house. And make a long story short, she didn't do that. But if they would have told her ahead of time and she would have agreed, I would have had her put something in there like this, right? And maybe for $1,500, I'll go spend the day in New York and hand out flyers, but I'm not doing it for 7% or $20,000. I'm not doing it. You can do what you want to do, but I'm not doing it. So that's a really good tool that can be used. And then remember, on each page, the broker's going to sign and the seller's going to sign. And just a little tidbit that I use is whenever I'm doing a contract with a client, buyer agency, or listing contract, I always, every single time, have the client sign first. So when I send it out to them in DocuSign, they are tagged number 1 in signing order, and I am tagged number 2. And I do that because I can never control how long it's going to take for someone to sign a listing contract. And when there is no time is of the essence clause in the contract, the law defaults to it should be signed in a reasonable amount of time. But the word reasonable is left up to the opinion of the courts. So what I mean by that is, let's say I list this for $444,000 and I sign it and I DocuSign it and I send it out to the seller, and then the seller sits on it. They don't sign it, they don't sign it, they don't sign it. And then 2 weeks later, I'm at the bar, trash, and I get a DocuSign notice that the seller signed it. And now interest rates have gone up. It's turned into a buyer's market. The property's not worth $444 anymore. I'm planning on going on vacation tomorrow. I have 24 hours to get it on MLS, and I don't want to do it. But now I have a fully executed listing contract. Now what? So instead of letting that happen, I always have them sign first. And that way, if they sign 2 weeks after I send it to them and I'm at the bar and I'm getting ready for vacation and prices went down and interest rates went up, guess what? I'm not signing the contract. I'm going to tell them you waited and things changed. So I always do that to protect myself. Notice at the bottom, my information is on it because it's my brokerage and it's my listing. And what I want you to know about this is there will be times when people, civilians, say to you, oh, generally it's not going to happen with a listing contract, but maybe a lease or an agreement of sale. And they'll be like, yo, can you just loan me a form? Legally, there's probably nothing wrong with it. Check with your broker on policy. But one thing I want to let you know is that when you release these forms, I strongly urge you to not do it. When you release these forms to civilians, when I say civilians, I just mean people without a real estate license, and they go fill them out, your name, your broker's name is on that. And now if something happens and there's litigation, your name is going to be dragged into this case, even though you had nothing to do with it. And I know of one of our members who somebody stole one of her forms. It went to court and she got dragged into it, even though she had nothing to do with it. And of course, at the end of the day, I don't think that she was found guilty of anything, but she had to go through defending herself and all the aggravation. So I would be extremely careful. And if you're going to do it, my advice to you, of course, if your broker says it's okay, is to strike all that. And before you send it to the person, under the broker section, I would put no broker, NA, NA, NA all over the place, so it's clear that you had nothing to do with it. Here we go. Seller will pay the balance of broker's fee if property or any ownership interest in it is sold or exchanged during the terms of this contract. Here's what makes it exclusive right to sell. By broker, obviously, if we sell it, we get paid. Brokers, licensees, duh. Seller, if the seller sells it themselves, we still get paid. Or by any other person or broker, so XYZ Real Estate or my cousin Vinny, who's at my house for dinner, at the listed price or any price acceptable to seller. Or, and then we're going to go in. Now, in my common sense, not legal advice, my common sense advice is if I strike seller or by any other person or broker, if I strike that, now look what happens. It becomes an exclusive agency, doesn't it? All it says is that if I sell it or one of my licensees sell it, then the seller owes me a commission. So this line right here, these words are what change it from an exclusive agency to an exclusive right to sell. But again, don't strike those without checking with your broker. I'm not an attorney. Next, seller will pay the balance of broker's fee if a ready, willing, and able buyer is found during the term of this contract by broker or anyone, including seller. Again, you would strike this, and then it would become an exclusive agency instead of an exclusive right to sell. A willing buyer is one who will pay the listed price or more for the property, or one who has submitted an offer accepted by seller. So it's not just price though. So when we get into the meat of this listing contract, I'm going to point out other things, because when we say an offer, a price or more for the property, but it also has to comply with the other terms. So for example, if the seller, and we'll get into this more, but for example, if the seller says, I will accept cash only, and now you bring them a full price offer, but it's an FHA loan, and they don't want to accept it, you're going to have a really hard time fighting for your commission. So that's why we have to be very clear and explicit in the terms that the seller is willing to sell this property for, because even though they can change their mind later and accept an FHA offer, if they turn down an FHA offer because in the contract they said they're only taking cash, we can't fight for our commission because we didn't get them an offer that was acceptable to them. So C, the seller will also pay the balance if negotiations that are pending at the end of this contract result in a sale, or a seller signs an agreement of sale then refuses to sell the property, or if a seller is unable to sell the property because of failing to do all the things required of the seller in the agreement of sale, which is the seller's default, or the property or any part of it is taken by government for public use, which is eminent domain, in which case seller will pay from any money paid by the government. So it's so far it's covering us in any way, shape, or form that property gets transferred or conveyed. Now this clause right here is called the broker protection clause. And here's what it says. If a sale, this is still under the section where seller is going to pay us our commission if a sale occurs after the ending date of the contract, and or if the sale occurs within X amount of days. In my company, we put 60, it's going to be up to your broker. So if it occurs within 60 days of the ending date, and the buyer was shown or negotiated to buy the property during the term of this contract, and the property is not listed under an exclusive right to sell with another broker at the time of sale. So here's what this means. Let's say you hold an open house while your property is listed, while you have a listing contract, and you close it down at 2 o'clock, and at 2:10, a buyer rolls up, and at that point the seller is coming home and he's walking in. And the buyer says, oh, did I miss the open house? And so I was like, well, yeah, but you know, I'm just walking in, come in and look at it with me. So they start talking, which is a violation of the listing contract, because in the listing contract, it says that anyone who wants to see the property needs to be sent to the listing agent. But they walk in and they show the property, and the buyer said, you know, I really like your property. And they get to talking, and the seller says, you know, my listing contract's expiring next week, and if you can just wait a week, I'll sell it to you directly, and then we'll split the savings on that real estate commission. And so this broker protection clause protects us from that, because what it says is, and the problem is it's really hard to know, it's hard to police, it's hard to follow up, you have to know to look. But if they close the property and that buyer was shown the property during the time you had it listed, whether you're the one that showed it to them or not, and it's not currently listed under a new exclusive right to sell, because if it's an exclusive right to sell, then as cooperating brokers, we honor that contract, and we know that that new broker has the exclusive right to sell, and we lose our rights. If that happens during that 60 days, then we're entitled to a commission. And C, if a sale occurs, balance of broker's fee will be paid upon delivery of the deed or other evidence of transfer of title, that's settlement. If the property is transferred by an installment contract, balance of broker's fee will be paid upon the execution of the installment contract. So what this is saying is that we earn our commission when we procure a ready, willing, and able buyer, and we typically receive our commission when we go to settlement. And that's really important to understand the difference. We earn it when we procure a ready, willing, and able buyer. We receive it when we go to settlement. Okay? Any questions? I see stuff in the chat now. Is that for me? Oh, wait, it is. All right, let me read it. Oh, that's so funny. You listed at 4440 North 4th Street. Was there supposed to be a 0 on there, or you listed a condo here? A listing of commercial or industrial buildings be longer than 1 year. You know, that's a good question. I don't believe so, but I'm going to have to look that up because I mostly do residential. My gut says no, but now that you're asking, I want to check that. So I will check that. Okay, so next, broker's fee if settlement does not occur. If an agreement of sale is signed and settlement doesn't occur and deposit monies are released to seller, we can put in our contract that we're going to get part of that fee. And I put 50%. Did you guys know that? And the rationale behind it is I did my job. I found the buyer. If the buyer defaulted and the seller keeps the earnest money and then we put the property back on the market, I should earn part of that as my commission, and I'm taking 50%. Here's where it gets fun too. Cooperation with other brokers. Licensee has explained to brokers, brokers' company policies about cooperating with other brokers. Broker and seller agree that broker will pay from broker's fee, and this is in bold. Be aware that you're still going to have sellers who see this number and freak out thinking that they're paying an extra fee. So you have to preempt that fear and explain to them, this is coming out of my commission. It's not charging you any extra. So we're saying broker's fee, a fee to another broker who procures the buyer, is a member of the multiple listing service, and we can do three different options. If someone comes along and they're a sub-agent for the seller, we will pay them X. In my world, we don't do sub-agent anymore. When I first started in this industry, it was on its way out. I do not see it anymore. In 23 years, I've probably never done sub-agent. I've been buyer's agent. So in my world, I don't pay sub-agents. There may be some instances where people do, but I don't. I pay buyer's agents. So what I do is if someone represents the buyer, I'm going to pay them. My company policy is we pay half of our commission. And remember, this is a 7% contract. It is not a law that we pay them half. It is not even an ethical violation of our code of ethics if we don't pay them half. We're going to talk about this for a minute, and I invite discussion if you have something to say or a question. This contract, if you remember, the parties to this contract are the seller and the broker. This is between us and God. This is between us and the seller. It has nothing to do with the buyer's agent, meaning they're not part of this negotiation. Now, whatever we say in this contract is what needs to be disclosed and paid on MLS. So whatever this number is, we put on MLS. I've seen agents charge 7% and offer 2.5% to the buyer's agent. Now, do I like that? Do I think it's fair? Do I think it's nice and honest? Absolutely not. However, is it legal? I mean, is it illegal? No. Is it an ethical violation? No. Do I think it's good for the seller? No, and I'll talk about that in a little while too. But remember that the parties to this contract are the listing agent and the seller. It has nothing to do with the buyer's agent. So we're going to put this in here, and this is telling the seller what we're going to pay. Now, does anyone ever have a challenge that they want to talk about with saying what your commission is and having a seller try and beat you up on what you're asking for or challenge you and you have a hard time? So now is the time to talk about it. Anyone? All right.
I usually explain the seller how it's actually divided, that it's basically divided by 4. They don't know, they think that all the commission goes to you. And then I explain that the commission goes to the buyer agent, and then the buyer agent is splitting with his broker, and people don't know about it. They just think, oh, you get all commission.
Absolutely. That's definitely a valid point. And I think that although that's a good point, and it absolutely is, I tend to, when I'm explaining why I'm charging what I'm charging, and most people do it that way, but I just want to give you food for thought. And this is actually the crux of what I talked about in my #1 YouTube video, was finding your value proposition. So even though that's a good argument and it's valid, think about if you were the seller, right? You're selling, and now someone's telling you that you have to pay 6 or 7% or whatever the number is of your sales price. Well, if that feels like a lot of money to me as the seller, and you say to me, well, it's divided a bunch of ways, it has to go to a bunch of people, that's not making me feel like I'm getting anything for my money. That's making me feel like, okay, well, I have to pay for the broker and the agent and the this and the this. That's not about me, that's about you. I like to turn it around. I find it more comfortable and more effective to use what I call the WIFM, WIIFM, the what's in it for me. So the way I might explain that to the seller instead is I might explain to the seller, yeah, I know that you don't want to pay 6%, but here's the deal. When I list this property, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm a master at negotiating. Anybody can market it, but I'm going to get it out there and I'm going to get you top dollar for your property because I'm really freaking good at negotiating. It's one of my superpowers. And so at the end of the day, you're going to end up saving money because you're going to make more than 6% extra by listing it with me than you are if you sell it on your own, or you go list it with an agent who isn't as good at negotiating as I am. And when I'm able to offer other agents 3.5%, I'm enticing agents to bring me an offer. Now, the more offers we get, the better off you are, because I'm like a freaking savage and I'm going to go after them and I'm going to get you the absolute best numbers and the best terms. That 3.5% that you're paying, that 7% you're paying is going to seem like nothing. It's going to be pocket change, because you're going to unleash the fierceness of how I negotiate. And I do it with like a slap and a kiss. They don't even know that I beat them up. They have no idea, because they think that I'm their best friend, because I treat everybody with love and respect, but I'm going to get you every single dollar out of that property. And so you can say it in your own way. And that was a bit of an exaggeration of how I really talk, but you see how I turn that around and I showed what they're getting for their money, instead of like, oh, but I need money and the tax man needs money and this person needs money, because that's not the seller's concern. The seller's concern is, what are they getting for their money? So I find that it's a lot more effective if you figure out the WIFM for your seller and show them how that's going to help them make more money, or how that's going to help them sell their house faster, or how that's going to help them not have to deal with a lot of the drama. It's going to take away some of the work for them instead of them doing it themselves. They're basically paying for a service. Whatever your value proposition is, turn that spotlight and focus it on the seller and how it's benefiting them, rather than turning it on you and talking about how I deserve. I just find that's a little bit more effective in the long run, but whatever way works for you. Okay. All right. Now, unless there's any more questions, raise your Zoom hand so you pop up. I don't even know who was talking to me, because without raising your Zoom hand, you didn't pop up on my screen. So whoever was, thank you for your comments. So the next one, someone who doesn't represent either the seller or the buyer. So you sometimes will have a transaction licensee. Sometimes, is anyone ever done transaction licensee? I love doing transaction licensee. Transaction licensee means you don't represent them. There's no fiduciary. You're just being hired to write up the paperwork, to help them get through the transaction. So if somebody has an agent, but that agent signed a non-representation agreement with them and they say, you go find the house and I'll just be your transaction licensee, I'm not going to represent you, I'm just going to help you with the paperwork, then I'm going to pay that person, I'm paying them 1%. And as long as I put this and disclose this on MLS, we're good to go, and then I honor it. Okay, any other questions about commission? Okay. Duties of broker and seller. Remember, this is a bilateral contract. This is an employment contract. The seller is employing you, the broker, to work for them. So we have to talk about what the job description is. Here's what the job description is. Broker is acting as a seller agent as described in the consumer notice to mark, which you should have signed with this person, to market the property and negotiate with potential buyers. Broker will use reasonable efforts to find a buyer for the property. Reasonable means not driving to New York and handing out flyers to brokers. That's why we said, no, we're not doing that. That's not reasonable. Reasonable is up for negotiation. I would say that is not under reasonable. Seller will cooperate with buyer and assist in the sale of the property as asked by broker. This is a big one. Who's ever had a seller that ghosted them and then doesn't allow showings and doesn't answer phone calls and doesn't put the dog away even though the dog is supposed to be away? Now the seller is not cooperating, and this is a commission issue. This is a breach of contract issue. C, all showings, negotiations, and discussions about the sale of the property, written or oral, will be communicated by broker on seller's behalf. All written or oral inquiries that seller receives or learns about regarding the property, regardless of the source, will be referred to broker. The guy that knocked on the door, that came up after the open house and said, oh yeah, no, the seller was in violation of this contract. The seller should have said, oh, open house is over, here's my agent's card, call my agent. Well, you're here, can you just, sorry, I can't. Talk to my agent, they'll be more than happy to help you. That's what the seller is supposed to do. D, if the property or any part of it is rented, seller will give any leases to broker before signing this contract. If leases are oral, seller will provide a written summary of the terms, including the amount of rent, ending date, and tenant's responsibilities. We need these ahead of time because they can fundamentally change the product that we are marketing and selling. If an investor is buying a property that has rental income, the amount of the income and the expenses and the terms of the lease are going to affect the value of the property. If you have a duplex and the units are rented out at $1,500 a month and they have automatic rent increases and the tenants pay all the utilities, is that worth the same as if they're $1,000 a month and the landlord pays all the responsibilities and they each can have 7 dogs with no security deposit? It fundamentally can change the value of the building. So you need to have these leases ahead of time, not just asking the landlord, well, how much is the rent? You need to see the terms and conditions of the lease. And best practice is to now put that information in the MLS. You don't have to upload the leases because they have personal information of the tenant on there, but you should definitely put the terms of the lease and the rent and when it expires in the MLS in the correct fields so that when agents are searching for this property, they can easily see the numbers and calculate the cap rate. And that's a whole other webinar that I'll do another day if Matt asks me nicely, because I love talking about cap rates. Okay, so it also says seller will not enter into, renew, or modify any leases or enter into any option to sell during the term of this contract without the broker's written consent. And here's how I like to think of it. When the seller signs this listing contract with you, it's almost like you have an equitable interest. If you remember equitable interest, it means that you have some sort of, not necessarily ownership, but interest in this property. Now, when a seller signs this contract with you, you don't own the property. It's not your property, but you have it tied up for like a year or whatever the term of this contract is, because the seller has promised to you that they're hiring you to pay you for selling this property. Now, in most worlds, like attorneys, accountants, doctors, you get paid at the time of service. You get paid up front. But in our industry, for some bizarre reason, we get paid when it closes, which may change. You have the tools to make it change. You may decide to play with that a little bit. But if we're saying to a seller, we're going to take this contract and we're going to work our tails off for a year to sell it and be legally responsible, because we can always be sued for anything. We're going to do all this work. You're going to pay us at the end if and when we find a buyer. Well, you have to promise me, Mr. Seller, that you're not going to change my product. You're not going to change what it is, what I'm selling. If you enter into a new lease, that might change things. Because if I market this property and say the lease is ending July 15th, I now open up a pool of buyers who might want to move into that property. Maybe they'll settle July 16th and they want to live there. So if I market it and I price it that way, and now in the middle of July, the landlord just goes and signs a new lease, now I have to change all my marketing, and maybe now I'm not going to be able to sell it, and I've done all this work. So it changes things. And that's why we have that clause in there. And we have to explain to the seller, you
Did you freeze?
I thought it was just my computer. I think she did.
Janice, can you hear us?
Yes.
So we seem to have lost you temporarily.
Yes.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we take a 5-minute break and let Janice get back in here? So how about this? 2:05, get back in, okay? 2:05. We'll take a little break. All right, see everybody soon.
Jessica, we just lost you.
So cool. Sorry about that. I am on a different network now, Wi-Fi, so hopefully it won't happen again. But if it does, I'll just come right back. Okay, so we are going to get back to the screen share. And if there was anything in the chat, I missed it, so put it back in. And if not, we're just going to continue on. Okay, so here we go. We were under paragraph 9, broker service to buyer, and all this is saying is that we, even though we represent the seller, it's not going to be a violation of a fiduciary. We can do things for the seller and charge them, like ordering certs or any kind of administrative stuff. The next one is paragraph 10. It says the broker is not responsible for damages. So seller agrees that broker and licensees are not responsible for any damage to the property or any loss or theft of personal goods from the property unless such damage, loss, or theft is solely and directly caused by the broker and the broker's licensees. And who decides if it's solely caused by you or the broker or the licensees? Well, the judge decides who, or mediation, right? The judge decides who's responsible. So there are a lot of gray areas in life and in real estate. And so my advice to you is to not just lean on this paragraph, is to be proactive and try and minimize any risk that the seller is taking. So here are some tips that I give when I'm training my agents or when I'm listing property. The first thing is take the pictures of your children off the wall that has their name right underneath it in giant foot-long letters, because that picture is going to be on the internet, where any person with an internet connection in the entire planet can see your child's name in their photo. And I don't like to be an alarmist, but that's a little bit dangerous for people who are predatory. So that's the first thing I do, is no matter how cute Cole's picture is that you had done in a lifestyle shoot of your 2-year-old with letters this big with his name, take it off the darn wall, because it doesn't need to go on MLS. Put your personal effects away, such as papers, such as money, such as valuables, such as firearms, and such as prescription drugs that sometimes, unfortunately, people who are addicts will come into a house on a showing or in an open house specifically to go into the medicine cabinet and get their fix. So tell your seller these things to protect themselves, as well as good marketing, which is take your personal stuff down for the wall, make it neutral, make it a clean space so people can visualize themselves in there and not you and your whole entire extended family. So that's going to also help with damages. The other thing is, and this goes to open houses, a couple of quick tips while we're on it. If you're doing open houses and you're able to, it oftentimes makes sense to get another agent to come with you from your office, so that you have one person on one floor, one person on another floor. It's not only personal safety, which is a really big issue, but it's also a matter of protecting the seller's property, because you can't be everywhere. And so that's another way to help make sure that you will never have to lean on paragraph 10. 11, deposit money. Broker, if named in an agreement of sale, will keep all deposit monies paid for by a buyer in an escrow account until the sale is completed, the agreement of sale is terminated, or the terms of a prior written agreement between the buyer and seller have been met. Let's stop right there for a second. We'll put a pin in it right here so I remember where we were. The agreement of sale says, and there's other workshop, Heather's doing a workshop on agreement of sale, right? Oh my God, take the workshop, she's awesome. In the agreement of sale, it says seller or broker for seller, unless otherwise specified here, will hold the earnest money on behalf of the buyer in an interest-bearing escrow, or in a separate escrow account, right? Unless otherwise specified here. So by default, by agreement, not by law, but by custom, the listing broker is the one that holds the money. That can be easily changed if you put that right in the line. And I, as a brokerage a few months ago, decided company-wide, we're not holding escrow anymore. So whenever we list property, we always have to make sure that in the agreement of sale, it says the title company is going to be holding it. So when they're talking about in the agreement of sale, there's a place in there that you should know about. And so if you are holding it, if the listing broker is holding it because it's custom, this escrow account will be held as required by real estate licensing laws and regulations. Buyer and seller may name a non-licensee as the escrow holder, like a title company or an attorney, in which case the escrow holder, the title company or the attorney, will be bound by the terms of the escrow agreement, if any, but not by the RELRA, the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act. So they still have to comply with the law, but the RELRA, the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act, is sometimes stricter than the law. And as licensees, we have to abide by the RELRA. So all this is doing is disclosing to the seller that somebody else who holds the money, if we're not doing it, they might not be held to as high or strict of standards as we are, because they're not subject to the RELRA, the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act. Seller agrees that the person keeping the deposit monies may wait to deposit any uncashed check that's received as a deposit money until seller has accepted an offer. So here's what this means. When we have a signed contract and we receive an earnest money deposit in our hand, whether it's that day or 3 days later or 5 days later, whatever it is, according to the contract, by law, we being the listing broker, has to have that money deposited in the escrow account by the end of the next business day. That is never an exception. That is always the case. What they're saying here, and this doesn't really apply anymore, although I guess it could, but back in the olden days before DocuSign, we used to actually write up an agreement of sale, sometimes handwritten, and we used to paperclip the check to the agreement of sale and drive over to the listing broker's office and hand it to them. And they would literally not even look at an agreement of sale if there was no check paperclip to the top of it. In which case they would take the check and they would put it in the drawer, and then they would present the listing or the agreement of sale, the offer, to the seller, and we would go back and forth. That's what they're talking about here. In that case, before we have an agreement of sale that's fully executed, that check can sit in the drawer. Once we have a fully executed agreement of sale, then the check has to be in the bank by the end of the next business day. Now, that's stuff that really your broker needs to know. You're not going to need to know that on an everyday basis. But remember that this contract is between the broker and the seller, right? So even though you in your day-to-day life are not really going to do much with escrow deposits, you're an agent for the broker. And the broker is legally responsible for this contract. So you need to know this. You need to explain it to the seller, even though you're not the actual one that's going to be personally responsible for getting them in the bank on time. Make sense? Okay. B, regardless of the apparent entitlement to deposit monies, Pennsylvania law does not allow the broker holding the deposit monies to determine who's entitled to the deposit monies when settlement does not occur. So if the deal falls apart for whatever reason, it is not up to the broker to decide where that goes, even if it's obvious. Even if the buyer hands a document that says, my loan was denied because I got fired from my job this morning, give me back my money. If the seller doesn't agree, the broker can't step in until those two parties duke it out and figure out who's going to get the money. Broker can only release the deposit monies, one, if an agreement of sale is terminated prior to settlement and there is no dispute over entitlement, and a written agreement signed by both parties is evidence that there's no dispute, and that's the release and termination, and that's in zip forms that says we're terminating the contract and here's who's getting the deposit money, and then it's signed by both parties. Number two, if after broker has received deposit monies, they receive a written notice that's signed by buyer and seller directing broker how to distribute some or all the deposit monies, or according to the terms of a final court order, the judge can decide. And four, according to the terms of a prior written agreement between buyer and seller that directs the broker how to distribute the money if there's a dispute. That's like, we're friends now, so just in case things go south, we're going to agree now that if they go south, this is what you do with the deposit money. Seller agrees that if seller names broker or broker's licensees in litigation regarding deposit monies, the attorney's fees and costs of the broker and licensee will be paid by seller. That protects us. Okay. Number 12. Other properties. Seller agrees that broker may list other properties for sale and that broker may show and sell other properties to prospective buyers. Let's take a minute and step back on this one for a quick second, because if you've been out of real estate school for more than 10 minutes, you might forget about the fiduciary, and that's okay. You probably know it intuitively, but I want to go over the actual fiduciary legal responsibilities that we have, because that's kind of what this is talking about. When we have the fiduciary, which means we have the agent-principal relationship, they are our client, we owe them these legal responsibilities. They are care, confidentiality, obedience, accounting, loyalty, and disclosure. So loyalty says that we have to put their needs above and beyond our own, and we have to be loyal to them. This is why we have to put this in here, because we have to be clear and let the seller know, yes, I'm loyal to you, but that doesn't mean we're monogamous, right? I can still list other properties. And in fact, I can have an open house and a buyer could walk in and he could be unrepresented, and I could end up signing a buyer agency contract with him, and he doesn't like your house, and I can then take that buyer that I met at your property and go sell him another listing that I have. So the reason why this is in here is because if it's not in there, then maybe under loyalty, they sort of think that we're not going to be able to do that. And we need the right to be able to list as many properties as we want. Number 13, additional offers. Unless prohibited by seller, so we're agreeing with the seller ahead of time. If we are asked by a buyer or another licensee about the existence of other offers on the property, broker will reveal the existence of other offers and whether they were obtained by licensee identified in this contract. I'm going to translate this to English in a second. By another licensee working with broker or by a licensee working for a different broker. What does this mean? This means that unless the seller prohibits me, in which case we would just strike this, right? We would strike this if the seller is like, no, I don't want you to do that. So if this is not stricken, if I am asked, I'm the listing agent and you have a buyer and you call me up and you're like, hey, Janice, do you have any other offers on the property? And we do this all the time, right? Well, according to my agreement with my seller, I must disclose to you if I have another offer. Not the price, not the terms, but whether or not I have another offer. And furthermore, I have to disclose to you whether it's my own buyer, whether it's a buyer from another agent in my office, or if it's a buyer from a co-op agency. I have to. Now, I have very many mixed feelings on whether this is a pro or a con, and that's not what this class is really about, but we can talk about it later over coffee if you're really interested. But the point is, this is what you're agreeing to. So if your listing contract says this, you have to abide by it. Now, here's the fun fact. Let's say my seller struck this. They don't want me to disclose. Let's say that that's what happened. And now you call me and you say, do you have any other offers? And I say to you, I'm not at liberty to disclose. Am I telling the truth? You don't know, because that's between me and my seller. So there's no way. So if you call someone and you ask them and they say, the seller told me not to, you can't challenge that because you don't have access to the listing contract. So just know, you have to know where which document that lives in, so you can know that's between the seller and the broker, and it's not up to you. It's not a law, it's by agreement between the seller and the broker. Once seller enters into an agreement of sale, broker is not required to present other offers, not required. And there is strategy on whether you should or shouldn't present other offers to your seller. Some people think that you always should because it's in the best interest of the seller. I disagree, but again, that's discussed over coffee or martinis at a later date. Just know that it's in there. Next, this is a big one. Seller will reveal defects and environmental hazards. Seller, including sellers exempt from the seller's disclosure law. So let's back up for a second. Everybody remember which properties are required in Pennsylvania to fill out a seller's disclosure? Anyone? Come on, people.
Repeat that again.
Which properties in Pennsylvania are required to have a seller's disclosure attached? All 1 to 4 properties, 1 to 4 units. If it's 5 or above, it's not required. 1 to 4 residential units. So a single family, a condo, a duplex, a triplex, a 4-unit, a quad, they're all required. However, there are some sellers who are exempt from the seller's disclosure law. And one example would be selling a husband and wife, or wife and wife, or husband, spouses are selling to each other in like a divorce. They don't have to fill out a seller's disclosure. The executor of an estate doesn't have to fill out a disclosure. So on the seller's disclosure, there's a list of like, I think it's 10 types of people. 10, when I say types, I mean roles. They're acting in a certain role that are exempt. Even if the seller is exempt, they still have to disclose defects. They just don't have to do it on the seller's disclosure form. And in fact, in New Jersey, it's not even mandatory that you fill out the seller's disclosure. They have one, but it's not required. However, if you know of a defect, you have to disclose it. I guess you could just put it in the listing or in an email. To me, it's easier to fill out the seller's disclosure. But what they're saying here is that even sellers who are exempt from the seller's disclosure law will disclose all known material defects. Material means important. It's an important part of this transaction. It can affect the structure, the integrity, or the value of the property. They have to disclose all known material defects and or environmental hazards on a separate disclosure statement because it's Pennsylvania and it's a law. A material defect is a problem or a condition that, one, is a possible danger to those living on the property, or two, has a significant adverse effect on the value of the property. The fact that a structural element, system, or subsystem is near, at, or beyond the end of the normal useful life of such a structural element, system, or subsystem is not by itself a material defect. My heater is 27 years old and the life expectancy is 20 to 25 years, but it still keeps me toasty in February. That is not a material defect. It's just old. Seller will update the seller's property disclosure as necessary throughout the term of the listing contract. A pipe bursts, we find mouse droppings, the lights start flickering, you have to disclose it, and there's an addendum that you can add an update to the seller's disclosure so you don't have to go in and cross it off and make it a mess. C, if seller fails to disclose known material defects and or environmental hazards, one, seller will not hold the broker or licensee responsible in any way. Two, seller will protect broker and licensee from any claims, lawsuits, and actions that result. Three, seller will pay all of broker and licensee's costs that result. This includes attorney's fees and court-ordered payments or settlements. That would be money that the broker or licensee pays to end a lawsuit or claim. Real quick plug for Seller Shield. Seller Shield is now an added benefit through Zip Forms. Seller Shield is something that the seller, when you're listing a property, they can go through Seller Shield and it will help them complete this document because the document is very intense and very detailed. And it will also offer them insurance that they can pay to help them defend themselves if they're ever sued for filling out the seller's disclosure wrong. Now, my guess is it's not going to cover fraud, but it's going to basically be like E&O, like errors and omissions, so you can have access. And I just saw an email came out from NAR today. I'm on so many email lists, but there's something in there about Seller Shield. We just got an email about something, but if you need more information, email Donna and Matt, and they'll give you information about Seller Shield. Don't you love how I volunteer, you guys? All right. The property was built before 1978. So 1978 was a magic year in the United States. A lot of things happened. Two of them were lead-based paint got outlawed, and so did asbestos. Those two things became outlawed. So if a property was built before 1978 in the United States, it most likely has lead-based paint hiding somewhere, if not flaking all over the place. So what this section says is that if a seller is listing a property that was built before 1978, we must give the buyer the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home. In reality, I will tell you that it usually comes from the buyer's agent, but it's legally the responsibility of the seller to provide this pamphlet to them. The seller also must tell the buyer and the broker if the seller knows about lead-based paint. So they're going to fill out a lead disclosure, which is something that has to go with this contract, or not with this contract, with the agreement of sale, but they need to fill it out when they list the property so that you can present it. And it basically says the seller knows of any lead-based paint or doesn't know of any lead-based paint. It does not require that they get it tested. It does not require that they remediate. It simply requires that they disclose. So you need to make sure your seller has that document. And if the seller says, oh, the house was built in 1950, but we renovated it down to the studs in 2014, do we still need to disclose? And I hope you're all saying that the answer is yes, because unless it was new construction, there's still a foundation, and that foundation was built before 1978. So the answer is yes, you absolutely need to fill out a lead disclosure. Number 16, we're actually on time, which is amazing. Number 16, home warranties. At any time, at or before settlement, seller may purchase a home warranty for the property from a third-party vendor. Seller understands that a home warranty for the property doesn't alter or disclose any requirements of the seller. So home warranty, remember that heater that's 27 years old and it's not broken, but it's old? Well, a buyer might be a little bit nervous about buying a house with old appliances and old systems, but they're working. So what the seller says is, here's what I'll do. I'll offer you a home warranty. They're like $550 for the year. And now I'm going to buy this insurance policy, this home warranty, and this other company, this third-party company, is now going to cover anything that breaks over the term of the year. You might have to pay a deductible, but they're going to come out and fix it. And if they can't fix it, they're going to replace it. So lots of times sellers offer these, and it's a really great way to bridge that gap when we have old appliances or old systems. But what this is saying is we have to tell the seller, even if you offer a home warranty, it doesn't mean that you don't have to disclose that stuff is broken. You can't just be like, well, I'm offering a warranty, so I don't have to tell them the dishwasher doesn't work, because they'll just call the home warranty company and get it fixed. That's what this paragraph is saying. Seller understands, okay, so that's what that was saying. Recordings on the property. This is super freaking important, so I need you to pay attention to this one. Seller understands that potential buyers viewing the property may engage in photography, videography, or video telephony. I guess it's like your flip phone, I don't know what, your iPhone, on the property. Seller should remove any items. Seller should remove any items of a personal nature that seller does not wish to have photographed or recorded, such as family photos, important or confidential paperwork, including any information related to this listing or communications with broker or licensee, and all other personally identifiable information, birthdays, social security numbers, any other thing. Seller is responsible for providing the same notice to any occupants of the property. So in Pennsylvania, where it's considered, so with video is allowed in public spaces. And when a property is listed for sale, it's considered public, not public like where anybody has the right to go in it, but public where people will just be coming in and out. Therefore, a seller can have video on the property without telling people, but they cannot have audio without getting consent, informing the other person that they're being recorded. Therefore, this is what I suggest, because I always like to err on the side of caution. If a seller has video, I'm going to notify people, even though I technically might not have to. And I'm also going to notify the seller that buyers might walk through. Now, according to standards of practice and ethics, we're supposed to ask the seller or the listing agent if it's okay if we take pictures. But there's also this standpoint of, people are going to take pictures. So even though it's polite to ask, and it's probably best practice to ask, there are plenty of people who are taking pictures, and the pictures are on the internet. So we have to inform our sellers to be aware of that. And we also have to inform our buyers, always assume that you're being videoed. Always assume that when you're walking through a house, if you stand there and you're like, oh my God, I love it, and you start jumping up and down and rolling all over the floor about how much you love it, that the seller's sitting back there somewhere counting their money, watching you, knowing that you're going to pay top dollar for the property. So we have to put on our poker face, and we have to know that it's a different world we live in now. Any person, B, who intentionally intercepts oral communications by electronic or other means without the consent of all parties, is what I was just saying, audio, is guilty of a felony under Pennsylvania law. Seller understands that recording or transmitting audio may result in violations of state and federal wiretapping laws. And then this is indemnifying us. Seller hereby releases all brokers, their licensees, on and on, or any one of them who may be liable by or through them for any claims, lawsuits, and actions which may arise from any audio or video recordings in or around the property. So we definitely need to have this conversation with our sellers. And we all know these stories. I had one seller who had a Ring doorbell, and she was not recording audio, but she got a notification on her phone every time someone came to her house. And she texted me one day and she said, oh my God, the buyers have been in there for 40 minutes. I know they're the ones that are going to buy the house. And sure enough, they were. But even little moves that you make, like how long you're in the property or facial expressions that you make when you're in the property, the seller can be watching you legally and it will give up your position. So it's just something to be really aware of. Real estate recovery fund, we're all familiar with the real estate recovery fund. I hope you remember from school. So we have to notify our clients, our sellers and our buyers that there is a real estate recovery fund and give them the number to apply for. And if you don't remember, no shame, the real estate recovery fund is a fund that we all contribute to, that licensees contribute to. And that fund is there in case there's any client of real estate services or consumer of real estate services who was aggrieved by a real estate person. So a real estate salesperson lied, cheated, stole, misrepresented, and then the person, the consumer, sued them, got a judgment, but can't collect the money. That consumer can now call the real estate recovery fund and apply for payment. And there's rules and regulations about how much, them getting the money, but they can get up to $20,000 toward that judgment. And then the licensee's license is suspended until they pay the fund back with 10% interest. So we are notifying people where to go in case they sue someone and they can't get their money. Notices to person offering to sell or rent housing in Pennsylvania. This is fair housing, and this is really important. Fair housing, let me plug Fair Haven while we're at it. NAR, you're all members of NAR, and can I ask someone to throw the link in the chat? So Fair Haven is a simulated activity that you can do online, which is going to take you through real life examples of fair housing situations and how to deal with them. And without getting totally into fair housing, we all hopefully understand and know fair housing and are kept abreast of fair housing and updates to things. But there are plenty of times when even those with us with the best intention and the best education can be challenged. For example, my friend Michelle called me a couple of years ago. I'm Jewish, she's Jewish, and she said, I'm thinking of moving back from Florida. Where's a really good Jewish neighborhood that I could live with my kids? I can't tell her because that's a violation of fair housing. Yet it seems like friends for 20 years, I'm not hurting anyone, I could tell her. So Fair Haven is a really great way to go through these simulated examples of the things that might seem like a challenge where you don't feel like you're violating fair housing, but you are. So and it's free. So I strongly suggest that everyone does Fair Haven. So we have to notify our sellers when we list it. There is no discrimination. There are 7 protected classes under the federal fair housing law, and they are here: race, color, religion. Oh no, this is Pennsylvania. Sorry. Federal and state laws make it illegal for a seller or broker to use all of these things. So there's 7 protected classes under the federal, but Pennsylvania adds more protected classes, even stricter than the federal law. So this talks in here about how a seller can't discriminate under any one of these protected classes. And so to protect yourself in fair housing, you not only need to know what the protected classes are, but you also need to just generally veer away from ever talking about the people and only talking about the bricks. The 2 most common fair housing protected classes that I see people not really understanding are support animals and familial status. And they're often going to come up more in rental situations than they will in sales, but we're going to talk about them for a minute anyway, because they're that important. Because the seller probably won't care if the person buying it has a guide animal, unless it's a condo, then that's going to matter. And they're also usually not going to care if they're kids, but a landlord might. Anyone with a service animal or an ESA, which is an emotional support animal, must be allowed to have their support animal or ESA no matter what. It is not considered a pet. It is considered a support animal. It's almost like an extension of the person. And it is a protected class. And you are not allowed to discriminate in any way, shape, or form. You can't say no pets are allowed. That's fine. It's not a pet. It's a support animal. You can't charge extra security deposit. You can't charge extra money, nothing like that. And same thing with familial status. Familial status means families with children under 18. And a family can look like anything. What it means is you can't say no kids. So that's protected class. We have to let our sellers know they can't do it. We won't stand for it. And if they try and do it, we can cancel the listing, or better yet, not even take the listing. Any questions? Okay. Transfer this contract. Seller agrees that broker can transfer this contract to another broker when the broker stops doing business, they form a new real estate business, or join their business with another. Broker will notify seller immediately in writing if broker transfers this contract to another broker. Seller will follow all requirements of this contract with a new broker. So the broker has the right to transfer it under those conditions. No other contracts. Seller will not enter into another listing contract with another broker that begins before the ending date of this contract. So that's the beginning. The last one expires June 30th. This one can start July 1st. Seller can't sign another one until this one expires. Conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest when broker or licensee has a financial or personal interest in the property and/or cannot put seller's interest before any other. If broker or any of broker's licensees has a conflict, they will notify the seller in a timely manner. This is really big, and it comes up more than you can possibly imagine. So if you notice there's a conflict of interest, or you feel like there might be a conflict of interest, notify the seller right away. And if you're not sure, call your broker ASAP and talk to your broker about it. Entire contract. This is in all of our contracts, and I love this paragraph. It's really a sentence, but I love it. This contract is the entire agreement between broker and seller. Any verbal or written agreements that were made before are not a part of this contract. But what I love about this paragraph is that when we do an addendum to the agreement of sale or an addendum to the listing contract, the reason why we have to do an addendum is because we're adding something to the contract that wasn't there before. And this says right here that if it's not in the contract, it doesn't count. If it's not in the contract before we sign this contract. So anything we sign after has to be attached, or you can even go into the contract later and change it and initial and date it. But you can't just say, oh, I told you the blinds were not included. If it's not in this contract, it doesn't count. Marketing of property. Where permitted, broker at broker's option may use all these things: for sale sign, lockbox, key in the office, open houses, and advertising in all media, including print and electronic, pictures and videos, unless otherwise stated here. You will sometimes see people that don't want a sign, they don't want a lockbox. You have to put it in here, otherwise, at your discretion, you can do it. Make sure you go over this with people, because sometimes they don't realize you're putting a sign. I call it the curse of the genius. The more you've been doing this and the better you are at this, the further away you get from remembering what it's like to not know. So you just may assume, I'm putting a key, I'm putting a lockbox, I'm putting a sign, I'm putting it on MLS, but the seller doesn't realize, they have no idea. And then it hits, the sign goes up and they're like, what the? And you surprise them and they're not happy. So it's better to tell them ahead of time. And then if they object, you can either just say, okay, or you can try and help them overcome that objection if you think it's in their best interest, but it's always best to inform them. So seller does not want the property to be displayed on the internet, or does not want the address of the listed property to be displayed on the internet. These are probably not in the best interest of the seller. So if you're gonna do this with them, it's either because it's some sort of pocket private listing, or because they have other reasons, but I would explain to them why it's probably not in their best interest, because we want to get the most exposure. And it says that right here, seller understands and acknowledges that if the property is not displayed on the internet, consumers who conduct searches for listings on the internet, which is about 100% now, will not see information about the listed property. Next, seller understands and acknowledges that if an open house is scheduled, the property address may be published on the internet in connection with the open house. Otherwise, people aren't going to find it. Go to that corner and take 3 steps to the left and you'll see the yellow balloons. Like, we have to put the address on or people aren't going to find it. There are many ways of marketing properties electronically. Some brokers can use a virtual office website known as a VOW, or internet data exchange known as IDX. That's when you go on someone's website, a company's website, it says search the MLS here. You search through your website, and we're basically exchanging data with all the other MLS members, and it's a really great way to capture leads and bring them onto your own website. So we use that. IDX, which are governed by specific rules and policies, sellers have the right to control some elements of how their property is displayed on a VOW or IDX. So a real quick, I'm no tech wizard, but we put our information into the MLS. And then the MLS obviously is accessible by all of the MLS members, but the MLS also syndicates our feed to third-party websites like Zillow, like Redfin, like Realtor.com. And so when we plug our information into MLS, there are 2 boxes on there that we can check that say disable this and disable this. And what that's going to do is that's just going to stop those 2 fields from syndicating to those third-party websites. So we can control limited amount of information. We can control comments or reviews about sellers' listings or hyperlink to such comments or reviews. And we can automated estimates of the market value of sellers listing or hyperlink. We can control those. And I don't know exactly how they're controlled because I'm not a tech wizard, but that's what that's referring to. And the next time you go into MLS, you can look in a listing and you can see those fields, and those are the boxes that you check off. Now, do they or do they not want it on the MLS? Again, it almost always makes sense to put it on the MLS, but there are times when I've not put it on the MLS. For example, I know the seller, I know the buyer, I don't even list it. I work out, I'm like, you want to buy this property, you want to sell it? Okay. And then I write up the paperwork to list it. And then I do an agreement of sale, and I'm not bothering to put it on MLS because it's a whole big lot of extra work and it's not even going to be available. It's basically a private in-house sale. So that's the only time that I've ever not used the multiple listing service. Seller agrees that broker and licensee and the MLS are not responsible for mistakes in the MLS or advertising of the property. Company policy I initiated: when we list a property, the listing agent must do a PDF of the MLS sheet and have the seller sign it. That way I have in the file that the seller saw it and agrees with everything. So if later they come on and they're like, you listed it at the wrong square footage and that's why it hasn't sold, well, you signed off on it. So that's what I do. Publication of sales price. Seller is aware that the MLS, newspapers, websites, and other media may publish the final sales price of the property. They will. It's public record. It becomes public record. Copyright. I'm not going to read the whole copyright, but what this is saying is that the seller grants us a copyright to use materials like pictures and photographs and all that kind of stuff, and that the license can't be revoked by the seller. They can't come in later and say, well, that's my living room and I designed that wall and you took a picture and I have it copyrighted, because we're selling the property. The other thing is that the seller understands, this is the last sentence, seller understands that the terms of this license, of the license, do not grant the seller any legal right to any works that the broker may produce. So the seller can't take our pictures, they belong to us. And furthermore, other agents can't take our pictures. So if you list a property, this is super important, you list a property that was listed prior, you can't just take their photos and list them in your own. You need to get your own photos because they don't belong to you. And I see people doing this all the time. Fixtures and personal property. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you should do this on your own. So here's paragraph A. It is possible for certain items of personal property to be so integrated into the property that they become fixtures. So the bookshelf that we put up against the wall and then we nailed in and we caulked it, that becomes a fixture. So now it's attached in such a way that it becomes a fixture, which is part of the real property. Therefore, that would be included in the sale. Seller is encouraged to be specific when negotiating what items will be included or excluded in a sale. Personal property and real property and mixing them up is one of the major problems that agents have, and it usually comes out of the agent's commission. So, for example, if there's a fancy stove, and this is a real story that someone told me, there's a fancy stove that the seller spent 6 months waiting for to come from Italy because it was custom made, and it was $25,000. And she put it in her condo knowing that she was going to take it out when she moved. And the buyer, who happens to be a chef relocating to Philadelphia to open a restaurant, buys the condo mostly in part to this really amazing stove that he knew exactly what it was when he saw it, and shows up the day of settlement for the pre-settlement walkthrough, and the stove is gone, and the buyer freaks out. At the end of the day, the seller had to put the stove back, and my guess is the listing agent paid for it. And why? Because a stove is real property. And if a seller messes up and takes something, maybe it's your fault, maybe it's not your fault. But if you're walking through a property with a seller, you don't necessarily think to say the stove is real property. I don't think to tell the seller the wall is real property. I just assume that it's known. However, if the seller had such a big story about this amazing stove that she waited 6 months for and spent $25,000 and it came from Italy, she probably mentioned that to the listing agent at some point in time, which should have triggered the listing agent to say to her, you know what, Mary? Stoves are real property. That has to stay. If you don't want it to stay, we have to list it here as an exclusion. Okay? Now, I want to say 2 more things about this. The first thing is the parties to this contract are the seller and the broker, which means if the seller says to me, I'm not including the stove, we're going to put that in our listing contract. And now if I bring her an offer and the offer says full price, but I want the stove, the seller can agree to sell it with the stove. But if the seller does not want to sign that contract and doesn't want to sell it with the stove, I have not earned my commission. So what we put in the listing contract does 2 things. It tells us what the seller wants, so we can make sure that when we negotiate, we're negotiating on behalf of our client. But the other thing that it does is it defines what we need to do to earn our commission. And so it is super freaking califragilistic important that we are clear in the inclusions and exclusions in this contract. And it's also super important that you actually read this section so that you know by default certain things that are considered inclusions. So for example, window covering hardware, shades, and blinds. How many times do you walk through a property and not know if that's personal property or real property? Well, guess what? It's right here in the contract. Unless you list it as an exclusion, it is considered a fixture and it goes with the property. If the seller agrees in an agreement of sale to include something that they listed here as an exclusion, I personally, because I'm always covering my you-know-what, I always get something else in writing from the seller acknowledging that they realize, even though you told me the stove was excluded, this full price offer wants the stove. Are you sure? And I do that in an email or a text so that I have something in writing, and that so the seller is aware and they're not just signing the contract and they didn't just notice that the stove was included. Make sense? One more thing I want to say is that a fun fact, in the inclusions that are listed in the listing contract are a little bit different than the inclusions that are listed in the agreement of sale. And I notified PAR, so hopefully they're going to go in and fix it. I'm hoping it was just an oversight. But the main one that stands out to me is TV mounting brackets. TV mounting brackets are listed as an inclusion in the agreement of sale, but they are not listed in the listing contract. So make sure when your seller signs the agreement of sale, you also skim over the list of inclusions and make sure they're aware that all those things are staying. And if they don't want some of those things to stay, then you're going to strike those or list those as exclusions. Okay. Taxes and special assessments. This section, you're going to go through and you're going to fill out every single thing. And why are you filling this out? One, so you can disclose to the buyer. Two, and a big hard two, is to protect your commission. You're going to disclose what the taxes are, what the assessed value is, because this is how you're going to market and sell the property. If the seller tells you, and you should obviously check the taxes in public record, but if the seller tells you the taxes are $2,000 and you go to market and sell the property and they're really $10,000, you might not be able to sell the property for that full price. If the seller lied or didn't disclose or whatever, now you can go back and you can say, you agreed that we're selling a property with $2,000 worth of taxes, not 10, you owe me a commission. Same thing with condo fees, municipal assessments. And then we're also going to talk about mortgages, and this is a really big one. So seller has a first mortgage, a second mortgage, any past due judgments, past due property taxes, all these things, and a line for other. You need to go over this with sellers because sellers sometimes don't realize that judgments and that child support or tax liens are going to affect the sale of this property. And so by having the seller put in here what is owed on the property, we can do a quick math equation and say, okay, it all adds up to $270,000 plus closing costs. We're good. Good at selling this. They're most likely not going to be able to sell this property. And so you need to go over this with them and make sure that they're aware that they have to disclose all of these things and that you have to do the math and make sure they can still sell the property. Okay. Buyer financing. What types of financing will they accept? Again, they can change their mind and always decide that they're going to accept FHA later, even if they didn't tell you they were, but this is protecting your commission. This is saying if I bring you a cash, a conventional, or an FA mortgage, you're going to accept it. And if you don't accept it, I still earned my commission because I procured a ready, willing, and able buyer. One quick thing about FHA is that FHA appraisers come out and appraise for value, just like conventional appraisers. However, they also have a list of repairs to look for, such as missing a handrail on anything 3 steps or more, rotting windowsills, peeling paint. So if they see any of those repair items, they're going to require that the seller fix them before the loan is approved and we go to settlement. So if you're working with a seller, and you should be asking lots of questions, and don't even get me started about the words listing presentation, because I think we named it all wrong. We shouldn't be going and presenting all about us to the seller. We should be asking questions and listening and figuring out how we can help them solve the problem. Sales is service. So when we're going there, we need to ask the right questions because they don't know what they don't know. So if we see that there are certain things that an FHA appraiser might flag, when we start talking to them about the kinds of financing, we have to say, well, an FHA appraiser might require certain repairs. Are you ready, willing, and able to complete those repairs before closing? And if they're like, I'm not doing anything, or I have no money, or whatever, then we don't want to tell them to accept FHA financing because the deal is not going to close. So we have this duty that we not only have to know things, it's also the stuff that we're expected to know. So there we go. Seller assist, same thing. If you ask the seller, let's say they're in a market where most of the properties are going FHA and people are getting seller assist, and you know that because you pay attention and you look on the MLS, you have to discuss this with your seller ahead of time. If your seller says, sure, I'll do a seller assist for the right price, I'll do a 6% seller assist for the right price. We had a space bar. That's a fun fact. If you need to change this, one of these fields, you hit the space bar and it'll turn a different color, and then it'll allow you to put a percentage sign in there. So if they agree to pay a seller assist, and now you have an offer that comes in and they're asking for a seller assist, but all the other terms are acceptable, purchase price, closing date, blah, 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 the seller owes you a commission. And that's why it's super important to have these conversations now, even though they could say no here, and then you could bring them an offer and they could change their mind. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to protect your commission, to be clear with the seller and have these conversations with them now, because the more educated they are now, the better we're going to have an easier time when we have to present the offers. Special instructions. This is just a disclaimer that's in all of our contracts that says it has to comply with the Pennsylvania Plain Language Consumer Contract Act. And luckily our attorneys at PAR, have our backs, and it does comply, so we're good. And then this is where any addenda that are going to be included or special clauses, we get checked here. And then those are attached and become part of the agreement of sale. Remember, paragraph 23 said, this is the contract in its entirety. Well, now it's not. Now it also includes a short sale addendum. So that's why this section is really important, because of paragraph 23. And then additional terms, this is where you go to jail for being an attorney without being an attorney. So you have to be really careful about what you put in here, because we are allowed as licensees to fill in we are allowed to fill in the blanks, but we are not allowed to write contracts or write clauses. So the golden rule, the standard, and I know not everybody abides by this, but the way it goes is that you are only allowed to put stuff in there that is written by an attorney. Now, in reality, we're not going to call an attorney every single time we need to add something in. That's why we have lots of addenda that we can use that are written by PAR attorneys. But there are some times when we use the same language over and over again to amend the contract. So what makes sense is to have an attorney write it up one time, and then it becomes proprietary language. You've paid for them to write it up, and you have like a library or a bank that your broker will have of proprietary language that's backed by an attorney that you can then copy and paste and put in the agreement. In the times when it gets complicated, it makes sense to have an attorney review it, because the money that you spend on reviewing it with an attorney now is going to save you money and aggravation in litigation later on. And then the last few things, remember, I always think of this as a checklist. The seller is certifying that they've read the consumer notice. You always have to have the consumer notice. That's just a reminder that they received the seller's disclosure and they agree to complete it in a timely manner. I would be clear with them on when they need it. And furthermore, once you start talking to somebody about listing their property, the first thing you do besides the consumer notice is send them the seller's disclosure and tell them start working on it now, and that way it's ready right away. Seller has received the lead hazards disclosure and agrees to complete it again in a timely manner, do the same thing. And you know, when you list a property, we can upload those documents right into MLS, because we're supposed to give them to a buyer at the first introduction to the property, and it makes our life easier. Seller read the contract. Before signing, seller must sign this contract. They give permission to the broker to send information about this transaction to the fax numbers and emails listed. Return of this agreement and any addenda and amendments, including return by electronic transmission, constitutes acceptance by all the parties. These are in all of our contracts. This contract may be executed in counterparts. Those are the old days. We send it FedEx to New York. We send it FedEx to California, because the partners are living on opposite coasts. They each sign their contract and send it back. We put it together. That's counterparts. It never happens anymore because of DocuSign. And then this is big. One of my agents, I don't know if Dean is here, had a question for me the other day about attorneys. This is super important. It is not common. It is not custom in our market to have attorneys part of the transaction. And sometimes it feels like they're a pain in the butt and they're making our job harder, but it is oftentimes in the best interest of the client to have an attorney, and it takes a lot of the liability off of us. So we have to notify them that before signing, if you have any questions, you are advised to consult a Pennsylvania real estate attorney. I always, if they start asking me complicated questions, I always defer to, I'm not sure you should ask an attorney, I'm not an attorney, because it's not about me sounding like a know-it-all. It's about me protecting my client, and it's about me protecting myself, because I do not want to get sued, nor do I want to be thrown in jail for practicing law without a license. Oh my God, it's 3:02. I said 3 o'clock, 3:01. I'm done, but I'm here for questions. Look at that, on time. Anybody have any questions? Oh, wait, I have, I have questions in the chat. Do ESA clients have to pay a pet deposit or pet rent? No. ESA is emotional support animal and is covered under fair housing, and it is not considered a pet. Don't even use the word pet. It's almost like a slur. They're not a pet, they're a support animal, and you cannot anything extra. Under typical, excuse me, under typical buyer agency terms, is the cooperating agent responsible if the buyer breaks or damages during, I don't believe the buyer agency contract says anything about that. Do you guys mind if I take 1 second and take a look to answer that question? Starting and ending date, broker's fees. I don't believe there's anything in there. Let me just double check. Transfer confidentiality, deposit money, sex offenders, no inspections, recordings. No, there's nothing in there. So I don't know how that's going to go down if there's an issue. Sorry, that's the best answer I have, but I've never seen anything in there. Okay, I did a lot of talking. Anybody have any questions? No? Nothing? Well, if you do, you can send them to me later. I'm easy to find. You know my name. I'm all over social media. Okay. Matt, you got anything for me?
All right, I think that's pretty good. Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to Janice. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for tuning in today.
Thank you. I hope it was helpful. Yes?
And,
okay, good.
Yes.
All right, I see this was great, all caps with multiple
Oh, you do?
exclamation
Oh my
points.
God, yay. I want to read the chat. I love seeing that. That's awesome. I'm so glad, because I know these contracts can seem really boring, and I totally nerd out on them, but you should really take some time to read them. And full disclosure, I'll make it quick. Like I said, I've been in the business 25 years. I started teaching about 5 years ago. Until I started teaching, half of the stuff I didn't know. Like, I was doing these contracts and I didn't know. I wasn't, and the truth is I wasn't really reading my own contracts that often. But I'll tell you how much my business has changed since I started really knowing those contracts, because it not only is protecting me and protecting my clients, but the real benefit, I'll tell you this, well, there are two. The one is that there are tools there that you didn't know you had. Like, you can charge them upfront for part of the commission, and you can do that under buyer agency also. But the real true benefit is that I have such a level of confidence now, because I know my contracts, that when I talk to somebody, when I talk to a potential client, I don't stutter at all, because I know these things backwards and forwards in my sleep, and it makes me a better salesperson, and it makes me enjoy my job better, because I never feel like I don't know, because we all feel at times we don't know stuff, or like they're going to ask me a question that I don't know. And then the problem is, when that happens, your anxiety level starts to go up. And when your anxiety level starts to go up, your amygdala goes into fight or flight. And when you're in fight or flight, you can't serve your client, you can't serve yourself, you can't close a deal and put food on the table. So the more confident you are with all of these contracts and procedures, the better you're going to keep that anxiety level down. And then, do you see when I just got asked the question about the buyer agency contract and I didn't know the answer, did I freak out? No, because I'm confident in myself. And so I'm okay with saying, I don't think so, but let me check. And so the more you know these contracts and the more you can raise your confidence level, the better off you're going to be when someone, because they're always going to ask you questions that you don't know. And guess what? That's okay. But the problem is when they ask you a question you don't know, and then you choke or you get defensive depending on your personality, and then you puff up your feathers and you act like a know-it-all. Neither one of those work. They repel people and they raise your anxiety. So take the time and read your contracts. And the way that I did it was, first of all, my first 2 minutes, first 5 years of selling real estate, I was also a loan officer because I was afraid to sell houses because I didn't understand the financing. So I got a job as a loan officer, and every single document that came across my desk, even the closing and the post-closing documents, through those 5 years, I read every single document word for word. And by reading those documents, it now showed me what I didn't know. And it made me have such a deep level of understanding of the business that nothing scares me. Nothing. And it doesn't mean I know everything, but I'm never afraid to not know. And I have done some of the most interesting deals that you could possibly imagine because I'm curious. That's how you get lucky, by reading every document. So read your contracts. And if you have any questions, you can ask me about contracts all day long. I love them. Okay. Now I'm done, unless anyone has any questions.
There we go.
Okay.
All right, Janice.
Peace out. Bye, everybody.
All right. So long, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.